Okay, so welcome back, everyone. Today we're going to be continuing our study of European history in the Belle Epoque and in the early 20th century. And today we're going to be covering some material on science and some material on modernism and culture. So let me just get us started with a prayer and then we can dive into today's lecture. O God of goodness, in the mystery of natural disasters, we look to thee, trusting that there is an explanation that will satisfy our minds and hearts. Accept our compassion for our fellow men, our desire for their relief, and our hope for knowledge which shall control the forces of nature. Help us to help thee complete thy universe, O Creator Father, to remove its flaws so that we may be sub-creators with thee of the kingdom of thy love, in Jesus Christ. Amen. So we have two big topics for today, science and culture, and let's drive straight on into the slides. Okay, so I know that we've been talking about the inter-warriors lately in class, but we need to dip back a little bit earlier into the Belle Epoque, and we need to talk about what's going on in science in this period. So just as Anton von Leeuwenhoek shocked everyone with his discovery of microscopic wee beasties in the scientific revolution, scientists in the 19th century are also making all kinds of earth-shattering discoveries. And it's not the microscopic world that our scientists are now discovering, but the world of radioactivity and the world of quantum physics. And these things will be just as mind-blowing for people in the late 19th and early 20th century as von Leeuwenhoek's discoveries were for people in the 17th century. So prior to these discoveries in the late 19th and early 20th century, many Europeans saw science as being rational, as being sensible, as a way of making sense of the universe and the world around them. For Europeans who were losing their faith in God, science seemed like a reasonable substitute. Think back to the divine watchmaker analogy that the deists believed in the Enlightenment. This idea that the universe is a well-ordered machine governed by easy to understand and fully knowable scientific laws that are totally rational. The idea that we can observe the universe around us and that it makes a rational sense. But then into all of this comes some new discoveries which show that a lot of the models we had for the universe and for physics really are not working anymore. And one of the key groups of people who are involved in this are the husband and wife scientist duo, Marie and Pierre Curie. Marie and Pierre Curie, they discover radium and they discover polonium, which are both radioactive elements. And they discover that radium and polonium give off radioactive rays, and that these rays seem to be emitted from the very atoms themselves. And if you think back to when we talked about atoms way back in 9th grade, when we talked about Democritus saying that everything is made of atoms, atom means something which is indivisible, something which can't be cut. If you go back to your Greek roots, that's literally what it means. And here the Curies have discovered that these atoms are divisible and that they're breaking off little bits of themselves and shooting themselves off in these atomic rays. So Marie Curie, by the way, is especially important. She's the first woman to win a Nobel Prize. And she is the only person, male or female, to win a Nobel Prize in 2 different fields. So she wins her first Nobel Prize in physics that she shares with her husband, Pierre. And then she wins her second Nobel Prize all by herself in the field of chemistry. So in 2 back-to-back years, too, as you can see, right, 1911 and 1912. It's a very impressive achievement. Unfortunately for Marie Curie, she didn't really understand quite how radiation worked and how dangerous it could be. And Marie dies from leukemia that was brought about by prolonged exposure to radioactive elements. And just kind of a fun historical fact, if you ever want to go to the archive and work with Marie Curie's papers, they are still today so radioactive that you need to wear a protective lead-lined suit if you want to look at her papers, because they have absorbed so much radiation in her lifetime working on them. So the Curies are hugely important with discovering these radioactive elements that do things people had no conception of being possible before. So from the Curies, we move on to someone who's also very important, though someone who is in some ways maybe a little more boring, and that's Wilhelm Röntgen. So Röntgen discovers X-rays. And in all fairness to Röntgen, he does discover X-rays before the Curies make their discoveries. He actually wins the very first Nobel Prize in Physics in 1901 for his discovery of X-rays. Unfortunately, I'm not quite scientific enough to be able to explain to you exactly how X-rays work, but you know, we all know that they allow us to see inside of things, like see bones in the human body. And on the bottom right-hand corner of the slide there, we have a picture of one of Röntgen's X-rays, and that is an X-ray of his wife's hand. And the kind of dark circle on her ring finger is her wedding ring. So it's kind of romantic, actually. So we call X-rays X-rays because that's what Röntgen calls them, X's, and he doesn't quite know what these things are. But actually, in many other countries, the word for X-rays is actually Röntgen rays, to honor him for his discovery. In terms of physics, we also have the work of Max Planck, who basically invents the field of quantum physics. Planck is basically the father of the field. In 1901, he showed that energy is not only emitted from atoms, but emitted at unsteady rates, and emitted in uneven bursts, which again flies in the face of what people thought they knew about atoms and how physics work. Planck called these emissions quanta, and that's why we call the discipline quantum physics. So why does any of this matter? Well, Planck's discovery called into question the traditional distinction between energy and matter. So traditionally, scientists believed that energy and matter were two separate, distinct things, but Planck's research suggested that in fact energy and matter were interchangeable, and that the distinction between energy and matter is not as rigid as we used to think. Albert Einstein takes this one step further. Einstein was a German Jew who developed the theory of special relativity in 1905. Again, I'm not going to pretend to understand all of his theories or even some of the basics of what he's doing, but I'll try to explain it to you as best I can in layman's terms. I'm sure if you really want to know, I'm sure Prof. Cahill could explain it in much more eloquently than I can. So Einstein argued that time and space are not absolute, and instead they are relative to the observer. So the classical example is if you think about being inside a car and you're driving down, let's say, the Dallas North Tollway. The car is moving, but if you're riding in the passenger seat, you could be reading a book, you could be looking at a phone, and it's as if you're not actually moving, but the car is moving. And to add on to that, as you're moving, let's say you're going 65 miles per hour north on the tollway, and there are other cars going south on the tollway at 65 miles per hour. Even though both you and the other car are moving at 65 miles per hour, it seems like the car that is coming towards you is really moving at twice the speed it is because it's your speed added to the other car's speed. Or likewise, think about taking a trip on an airplane. When you're sitting in your seat, you can walk up and down the aisles at a regular walking pace, and it seems to you like you're just moving the same pace you would be if you were on solid ground. But in reality, you're also moving forward at a much faster velocity because the plane is also traveling as well. So Einstein also states that matter and energy are interchangeable, building on the research of Planck. Einstein, of course, comes up with this famous equation, E equals mc squared, where E is energy, mass is the letter m, and c is the speed of light, which is a constant. Another one of the important discoveries here in these early days of physics is the work done by Niels Bohr. Bohr discovers atomic structures. When you learn all that business of electron shells in chemistry, and the 2 and the 4 and all of that jazz that's in the side of those boxes on the periodic table, you can thank Niels Bohr for that. He's the one who discovers those kinds of atomic structures. Another major discovery comes in 1919 when the British physicist Ernst Rutherford splits the atom. And again, this is something which in theory people believe was not possible. Atoms are indivisible, and Rutherford splits it. And that picture on the bottom right actually is Rutherford's lab. And you can see, I always think it's kind of funny, it says "talk softly, please," as if the volume of your voice makes a massive amount of difference on quantum physics, but I don't know, I'm not a scientist. And then also in 1927, we have the work of Werner Heisenberg. Heisenberg postulated that it is impossible to know the speed and the position of an electron. In an atom, you can know the speed or you can know the position, but you can't know both. And we call that the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. Again, this is something that is pretty much the opposite of the kind of Newtonian physics that Europeans have believed in since the scientific revolution. How can you not know both where something is and how fast it's traveling? But Heisenberg says it's impossible to know both. And generally, by the way, we refer to the 1920s as the heroic age of physics. All these important discoveries are being made. And the reason we're talking about this is twofold. One, because these are important scientific historical developments, but also because this has a major knock-on effect in European culture, in philosophy and literature, in the way that Europeans conceive the world around them. And so on that note, I do want to shift gears and talk about philosophy. And we do have to go back a little bit here because all of these things are kind of working together. So in general, philosophy during the Belle Epoque and indeed during the interwar years as well, it tends to reject optimism. It tends to glorify the irrational. And so a prime example of that is Friedrich Nietzsche. This is someone we often associate with what we call nihilism. So nihilism is the rejection of all objective and moral truths, right? You're rejecting everything. If you're a nihilist, you don't accept that there is any objective truth at all. Everything is subjective, everything is relative. So nihilism is really his thing. In other words, so morality doesn't exist, truth doesn't exist. And to that end, Nietzsche also rejects many of our 19th century isms, liberalism, Marxism, a lot of the isms that we've spent a lot of the third quarter talking about. Nietzsche also wrote in a number of his works quite famously that God is dead. So Nietzsche, I think that should tell you a little bit about his religious views. I hope that's obvious enough to you. Generally, we say that Nietzsche was an atheist, though some scholars argue that his opinions are slightly more subtle than that, but I don't know how much more subtle you can make it than saying God is dead. Nietzsche, he branded conventional 19th century values, morals, and religion as slavery. You did have a brief excerpt from him in your textbook reading on page 725. As you probably noted there, Nietzsche is not a huge fan of Christianity. Nietzsche calls it, to quote him in that blowout, he says it's the great curse. So Nietzsche predicted that there would rise a few supermen or Übermenschen. Sometimes some translations also use the word overmen instead. If I remember rightly, your textbook and your reader use different translations to be extra confusing. But when we talk about supermen, when we talk about Übermenschen, when we talk about overmen, they're all the exact same word. It's just a matter of translation. Anyways, Nietzsche predicts that these supermen will arise and they will be above societal standards and above morals. They will be above good and evil. Those concepts will be meaningless. Nietzsche also rejects democracy. He rejects social reform. He rejects universal suffrage. The Nazis in lead up to World War II are huge fans of Nietzsche's philosophy, though we're told Nietzsche himself was not at all a fan of what the Nazis were trying to do. So this is part of why we're kind of lumping some of these Belle Époque and interwarrior things together, because really Nietzsche dies before the outbreak of World War I, but his philosophy is deeply influential on the Nazis in the interwarriors and in the Second World War. All right, so from philosophy, let's move on to psychology. The important figure that we need to talk about here is Sigmund Freud. It's worth noting, by the way, that a lot of the intellectual figures here, both in this chapter and in chapter 26, do have German connections, right? Nietzsche is German, Freud is Austrian, Carl Jung, who we'll talk about in a minute, is Swiss. Anyway, Freud, he challenges Enlightenment ideas about rationality, and he argues that humans are actually quite irrational. Freud argues that inside of everyone there are three forces: the id, the ego, and the superego. So Freud says that the id is man's primitive desire, that this is where aggression comes from, this is where sexual desire comes from. The superego then is what we would say is your conscience, kind of like the little Jiminy Cricket sitting on your shoulders there. That your conscience is an internalization of the will of society. So in other words, right, your conscience is kind of your sense of morals, right, your sense of right and wrong, whereas the id is this base animalistic desire. So that's the id and the superego, and that just leaves the ego, excuse me. And the ego is the balancing act between the id and the superego. The ego is the outward face that we present to the world, is our kind of struggle to balance these animalistic desires and our conscience together. According to Freud, these things, the id, the ego, and the superego, can never be totally in harmony with each other. They're always kind of in conflict with each other. And if they get too far out of balance, Freud says this is what causes madness. Freud is the father of what we call psychoanalysis. So for Freud, that principally meant analyzing people's dreams, their fantasies, their desires. We're not going to get into a detailed discussion about it, but you can read the blowout from one of Freud's books on page 727 of the textbook, where he talks about the importance of repressed memories and how they affect what we act, or how we act, and the kind of necessity of recovering those. Building on Sigmund Freud, then we also have Carl Jung. Jung was a student of Sigmund Freud. Jung believed, however, that Freud's ideas were a little bit too narrow. So Jung believed that dreams, rather than representing repressed memories, were openings to our spiritual needs. And Jung argued that we all have a kind of collective unconscious. So what he means by that is there are certain memories, certain kind of inborn cultural things that we all share as humans, that there is these kind of memories that are baked into all of us from birth, not memories like, oh, I had a peanut butter and jelly sandwich for lunch yesterday, but kind of deeper cultural things which are part of all of our unconsciousness as human beings. And Jung believed that this collective unconscious is what leads us to create myths, to create religions, to create philosophies. So Jung would say that the reasons that we feel compelled to create these religions, and that there are some kind of, or there is an overarching belief in some kind of deity or some kind of supernatural, is based in this collective unconsciousness, which is why we see so many cultures develop religions, develop myths, develop those kinds of things. So Jung believed that by tapping into this collective unconsciousness, we can obtain a higher degree of consciousness. All right, so I know this has been kind of heavy on science and philosophy and psychology, and as a historian, I'm probably not the best person to teach you those things, but these are all part of the culture that's going on in the interwarriors and in the Belle Epoque. And they shape the kind of culture that I'm more comfortable about talking about as a historian, which would be literature, which would be art, which would be mass society. And those are some of the things we're going to move into now. So if you remember, right before spring break, when we were talking about Impressionist painting, we were talking about this big cultural movement that we call early modernism. And we said that art historians, cultural historians, say that the kind of dominant culture in the West between 1870 and 1970 is modernism. And that the first phase of that lasts from 1870 until the First World War is what we call early modernism. And we had said, right, this is about rejection of the past. It's about searching for new forms of expression, focusing on what's current, what's secular, what's revolutionary. We talked about all those things when we talked about Impressionism and when we talked about some of the other artistic movements that come after it. But what I didn't have a chance to explain to you then is why this is the case. Why are we so obsessed with searching for new forms of expression? Why is there this constant desire to change, to focus on what's new and what's revolutionary? And the reason for that is all the things that we've just been talking about. The new developments in philosophy and psychology and science. You know, these may seem like odd bedfellows, but what they're all doing is they're working to change the way that Europeans see the world around them. All of these radical new ideas and new changes happening at a relatively quick rate are kind of driving these changes in culture and influencing these changes in culture. So we talked about the art the other day because we talked about Impressionism, we talked about Expressionism, we talked about Pointillism, we talked about all those things. We didn't really get a chance too much to talk about some of the literature of this period, and I want to move on to talking about that now. And right, product of philosophy, product of psychology, product of science. So one of the forms that we see modernism take in literature is what we call naturalism. So naturalism is all about focusing on objectivity, maybe ironically, given that we've talked about some of these irrational things. So in terms of subject matter, naturalist works tend to focus on working class people or working class issues. And quite often they also tend to focus on women's issues. So in France, we have works like those by the writer Émile Zola. Zola is probably most famous for his Rougon Macquart series of books. I apologize for my terrible French pronunciations. In Norway, we have Henrik Ibsen, who's famous for his so-called problem plays. Probably A Doll's House is one of the more famous of those, and that illustrates this emphasis on women's issues. A Doll's House is a story of Nora, who is kind of trapped in this loveless marriage and being blackmailed for her own personal misdeeds, and all the while she's stuck in this marriage and her husband treats her like a doll. That's the title. In American literature, we see similar things. Probably most famously, you have Kate Chopin's The Awakening. And just like in art, everything changes rapidly, and there are a ton of different movements here in literature. So one of the other new movements we have is decadence. So in decadent works, we see a scorn for science, a scorn for bourgeoisie values. And probably the best examples of this would be in English literature. This would be Oscar Wilde's The Importance of Being Earnest, or any of his works. I mentioned that one because, of course, our drama students put on a production of that last year. And, you know, if you went to see the play or if you've read it before, you can see how these kind of bourgeoisie people are kind of taken down a couple pegs for some of their uptight values or uptight beliefs. In France, we have Marcel Proust, famous for his remembrance of things past. And lastly, in terms of literary movements, we have Expressionism. And surprise, surprise, once again, we have scorn for the bourgeoisie. Expressionism is all about searching for new forms of expression. So it kind of does what it says on the tin. And a good example of this would be Franz Kafka. So Kafka wrote a lot of things. Metamorphosis, for example, is one of his works. So from the Belle Époque, let us move back into the interwar years and talk about some of the important cultural developments that we see there. So, into the interwar years, in the United States, we think of the 1920s as being the Roaring Twenties. You know, we think of this as being a pretty good period, right? We think about jazz here in the United States. We talked about that a little bit the other day when we talked about Impressionism and early modernism. Generally, Europe does not really have a Roaring Twenties. The 1920s, as we've talked about before, are a pretty lousy decade for most of Europe. You know, in the case of Germany, right, they are horribly weighed down by the reparations they have to pay. You know, even in the case of a country like Britain, as we've said before, the 20s are a period of terrible depression. Nevertheless, your friend Jackson Spielvogel does claim that the 20s in a place like Berlin might be described also as the Roaring Twenties. You know, and Spielvogel talks about things like jazz becoming popular in Europe, about Josephine Baker singing in French jazz clubs. And to a certain extent, that is true. But, you know, you need to ask yourself, who is really enjoying all this stuff? I mean, certainly there are people in those jazz clubs who are having a good time. But for very many people in very many parts of Europe, the 1920s, as we said, are a terrible period, right? This is a period of not just economic depression, but there's kind of spiritual and kind of emotional weight on everyone too, after all the troubles from World War I. Generally, it is not the Roaring Twenties. It is a pretty depressing time period. And I really disagree with Jackson Spielvogel's kind of emphasis on saying it is, because I don't think he's right. All right. Now that I've spent a while being depressing, I should say there are actually some very good and maybe uplifting things we could say that come out of this period. You know, we spent a lot of time in this course talking about high culture, talking about fancy paintings or intellectual works of literature, but there are some really important developments in low culture as mass society continues to change the culture of Europe thanks to the Industrial Revolution. So one of the big inventions of the interwar years is the wireless, what you and I would describe as being able to transmit messages through the radio. The wireless is invented by Marconi, who is an Italian. Marconi invents that in 1920. Marconi invents that, excuse me, and in 1920, we already see the first commercial, or not the first commercial, the first radio broadcast that's done for a mass audience. So, you know, not just people sending military transmissions or, you know, not just some kind of special messages, but things that are meant for public consumption. Mass production of radios rapidly increases in the 1920s. In 1922, the British Broadcasting Corporation, the BBC, is founded. And we know that in 1922, there were 2.2 million radios in Britain already. So 2.2 million potential households that could be listening to the BBC's programs. We have very good figures because of those sort of things, because then as now, you know, the BBC is funded by the government, and the BBC, theoretically, you're supposed to pay a license fee if you want to be watching that on the television, and in the past, a license fee for the radios. But yeah, 2.2 million radios in Britain. By 1940, we know that there are about 9 million radios in Britain. So there is a huge audience for news, for information, for entertainment on the radio. Along with radio also comes films. There had been some short movies that had been shot before World War I that were designed for music halls. But just before the outbreak of war, just before the outbreak of World War I, we do begin to see the production of full-length feature films. By 1939, 40% of European adults went to the movies once a week. So that's pretty significant. By the end of World War II, we know that that number was about 60%. So movies were cheap entertainment, and the global depression in the 30s helped to increase their attendance. So in Western countries, it was not uncommon for homeless or unemployed men or women to spend all day at the theater because it was a cheap, warm, dry place to escape from the cares of the world. So both of these new forms of what we could call mass media, right, radio broadcasts, films, these could also be mobilized for propaganda, unfortunately. The Nazis, for example, made great use of propaganda. You have, for example, the films of Leni Riefenstahl that your textbook talks about. And we do know that Hitler himself did credit his rise to power as being impossible without radios, without movies. That these he recognized were a huge advantage to his rise to power. So you can see all these things are kind of weirdly bound up. New scientific developments, changes in mass society, the development of mass politics. All of these things go hand in hand, believe it or not. And speaking of mass leisure, we do see continued important developments in mass leisure as well. Professional sporting events continue to gain in popularity. We've said that's not a new thing, but they are becoming more and more popular. We also see that these sports, particularly Hitler's Olympics in 1936, can also be leveraged for propaganda, just like films. So again, these things are related. We haven't talked about fascism yet. We're going to talk about fascism on Friday and next week. But you should know that the fascists in both Italy and Germany also use mass leisure, use the forces of mass society to further their agendas. So, for example, in Italy, we see the emergence of the dopo lavoro, which literally means after work. These were government-organized recreation societies, recreation clubs. So these would include libraries, these would include gyms, they would show films, they would put on tours, like package tours, holiday tours. This is very much meant to kind of win support. Likewise, in Germany, we see the development in the interwarriors under the Nazis of the Kraft durch Freude, which literally means strength through joy. And these were groups which sought to organize leisure activities for workers, concerts, films, package holidays. And in fact, we know in Germany, 130,000 workers took 7 million cruises and other short trips in Germany that were sponsored, or rather, German workers, I should say, not trips solely within Germany, went on these holidays, enjoyed these trips that were sponsored essentially by the Nazis. All right, so onward then to high culture. We're almost done, guys. Hang in there. So Spielvogel describes this period culturally as being one of nightmares and new visions. And I think that's a really apt description of the culture of this period. There is, again, this emphasis on the irrational, this emphasis on disorder. All of these things, like quantum physics and Freud and Nietzsche that had been building up before World War I are only magnified when the war ends, as people's lives have been shattered by the war. So in art, we see the development of German Expressionism. German Expressionism focuses on suffering and the shattering of lives by the war. It's very grim stuff. So in just a second here, I'm going to show you this work by the German artist Otto Dix. It's what we call a triptych. I don't know if you remember when we talked about these sorts of things from the Renaissance. A triptych is a piece of artwork that's usually set in the altar. It has 3 panels that kind of folds open. Usually write their typical religious themes, Christ or saints or Bible figures or something like that. Dix's triptych here is called The War. And here you can see it. So you've got these 3 traditional panels at the top, another panel on the bottom. And so instead of showing Christ or the Virgin Mary or some kind of uplifting religious scene, you just have this grim reality of war in all of the panels. The damage, the dead bodies, the dead, the dying. It's a very grim, very depressing kind of painting. So Dix has taken this very traditional format that European artists have been doing basically since the Middle Ages, and he has taken what should be a kind of a holy icon almost and turned it into this grim vision of death and destruction from war. In art, in addition to German Expressionism, we also see some other new flavors of modernism. There are 2 new flavors of modernism in particular, what we call Dada and what we call Surrealism. And we'll start with Dada. So Dadaism, it's exemplified by complete contempt for Western tradition, an emphasis on the irrational, and very deliberately so, just rejecting all of established artistic tradition, throwing it in the trash, essentially. They want to get rid of it. It's also then meant to be kind of playful, kind of joking. And so here is a good example of this. This is the German artist Hannah Hoch's cut with the kitchen knife Dada through Germany's last Weimar beer belly cultural epoch. It's quite a mouthful. And you can see she's made this basically collage of all kinds of different things. And she's even incorporated the word Dada in it a few times. So this is, typical modernist art in this period. And in addition to that, we also have Surrealism. Oh, I'm sorry, we have avant-garde, excuse me. Avant-garde. All of these works really are avant-garde. Avant-garde just kind of means experimental, radical. But another prime example of this from this time period is Marcel Duchamp's so-called Fountain. Although he's titling it Fountain, it is actually a dead common piece of porcelain that you could have found in the restrooms of either of the churches Cambridge has occupied. And he has essentially taken what is a urinal and he has signed a false name to it and dated it and passed it off for art. So this is what passes for art in this period. Not really my cup of tea, but whatever. Now we have Surrealism. So Surrealism, here we're trying to portray a reality that is beyond the sensible world, the world of the unconscious, right? Think about all this business of dreams of Freud and Jung. Trying to put some of that onto the canvas to try and depict this unconscious world, which oftentimes is very irrational and very crazy. And of course, probably the most famous example of surrealist art is Salvador Dali. This is his famous Persistence of Memory. So you've got something that's got kind of recognizable things in it, right? It's kind of like a seashore maybe. And there's part of a tree, and there are pocket watches and clocks which are melting. So it's not so abstract that it's totally unrecognizable, but at the same time, obviously there is nothing realistic about it. Clocks tend not to melt. And even if you look at the picture of Salvador Dali on the left there, his whole life is kind of based on this kind of surrealism. He's got the very pointy little waxed mustache. He's got his pet ocelot there in his snuggled up to him. So not very normal, we would say. To be quite frank, we would say it's surreal. All right, so lastly, in the world of music, we are also drifting away from conventional norms. We are trying to once again throw in the trash all of established Western musical tradition. So instead of using conventional scales and chords, we are now going to have music that we would say is atonal, literally discordant, intentionally kind of wrong sounding. So instead of using a normal scale, atonal music, or at least Schoenberg's atonal music, uses a 12-tone scale, which is weird. It's not a complete cacophony, but it does throw many of the rules of classical music out the window. I would personally say, as a historian of the 17th century, that it is not very pleasing to the ear, but who knows? It is, I guess, the kind of experimental music of its day. All right, so one last thing, sorry I forgot, and that is architecture, important architectural developments. And the important development in architecture is maybe perversely given everyone's desire to make crazy, irrational things. In architecture, instead, we see functionalism. And kind of the maxim here is form follows function, that the form of the building should be determined by its function. And the most famous functionalist architect is Walter Gropius, and he is very famous for what we call the Bauhaus movement, which takes its name from the Bauhaus building, which he designed on the bottom right. It gets the job done. It's not the most visually attractive building in the world, but it's functional. It's got windows, it's got doors, it's got stairs, all the kinds of things you need. And actually form follows function is Gropius's motto. All right, so to wrap things up for today. So what we've seen is modernism continuing to change, but being deeply influenced by all of these new developments in science and philosophy and psychology. And I know we've kind of rushed through a lot of those, and that's largely because we could spend a very long time trying to explain some of those things. And I think for a course like this, what we've done today is basically what you need to know if you're going to take the AP exam. But anyways, generally modernism is very much the product of all of these new changes that are throwing out what so many people think they know about science, about philosophy, about the human mind. So modernism is all about the rejection of the past, the striving for novelty. I mean, that's why there are so many of these small little flash in the pan movements: naturalism, decadence, expressionism, all the artistic things we talked about before spring break as well. And then after World War I in the interwar years, things only continue to get more and more bleak. All right, so that is where we are going to leave it for today. I hope you all have enjoyed watching this, and tomorrow when we meet again in person, we will talk about the rise of fascism in Europe. Thank you.